So I want to try out a new segment that I'd like to call The Builder Explains, where an average guy like myself tries to explain how certain things work that we deal with on an everyday basis. Today, I'd like to talk about capacitors. So hi, I'm Alex, and you're watching The Renaissance Builder. So life as we know it would not exist without capacitors. A lot of the electronic circuits that we take for granted, such as cell phones and computers and even calculators, simply are not possible without the use of capacitors. Capacitors are used to regulate electronic voltages and oftentimes used to regulate timings in small circuits. So here I have an assortment of capacitors. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. This little square capacitor was actually one I found in the dehumidifier that we took apart. These here capacitors are very common to the industry that I work in and specialize in the HVAC industry. And even this capacitor, which a lot of techs may not know, but is also very common in the HVAC industry in things such as drives and VFDs. This, you're like, well, that's a motherboard. That's not a capacitor. This thing has a boatload of capacitors on it and varied types of capacitors. You've got these little things right here. These are a certain type of capacitor, as well as, I'll see if I can actually point some out. These little, I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to try and zoom in for you. So if you see my fingertip right there, there's actually a tiny little capacitor they call a ceramic multi-layer capacitor right there on the motherboard. So there's a bunch of them on there of different types, shapes, and sizes, and they do different things. Let's get started with how they actually work. Now, I thought for this, I would actually break out the good old-fashioned whiteboard and talk about it. So without using a bunch of fancy camera angles and stuff, which would honestly take a lot more time, I'm going to draw it on here, and hopefully you can understand it. So the gist of the way capacitors work is they act like storage devices. Well, I should say one way that capacitors work is they act like storage devices. I'm not coming at this like a physicist, so my terms are not accurate. I'm coming at this like the average guy. So the average person, I want you to be able to understand at least what they do. Capacitors, not only do they act like storage devices in some circuits. For example, this capacitor actually came out of a variable frequency drive, and it was used to balance the DC voltage on that drive. So the way it works is kind of like a pressure tank in a plumbing system. And if you don't know what a plumbing system is, then you're not going to know what a pressure tank is either. There's also things in transmissions, so if you're a mechanic and understand hydraulic transmissions, then you can also understand these act as an accumulator. So there's a couple different ways to describe it, and to the absolute layman, the person that doesn't know anything about electronics, think of it like a balloon. All right? We put a bunch of air in that balloon stores the air, and then you can actually control how fast that balloon releases the air. So if you're a physicist or an electronics engineer out there, you probably just listened to the balloon explanation and you're smacking your head going, oh, that's not how it works. Bear with me. I know that this is, if you're smarter than I am, just bear with me a little bit. We're going to try and get through this because I want the average person to have an idea of how this works. So in the case of the storage style capacitor, we're going to draw this out. So I have a line coming in, and this is going to be direct current. So I'm going to say let's just say for ish and giggles, we're going to call it 100 volts DC. All right? So we got a 100 volt DC line. Now, whatever our load is out here, we're going to draw the load as a resistance. Whatever our load is out there, that might need more than, let's say I can supply 10 amps. So 100 volts at 10 amps. It's like 1,000 watts. I'm supplying 10 amps. Now let's say for small periods of time, I need more than 10 amps. if for that very small period of time I need more than 10 amps, what's going to happen on this circuit is, I know you can't see, I'm going to show it. So I'm going to show this. So what's going to happen on this circuit, if we need more than 10 amps for that small period of time, it's actually going to starve our power supply. And when it starves our power supply, we are no longer delivering the 100 volts that is needed for this to work properly. The current starts lagging and that will drag the voltage. So what we do is we just bring a little line off here, and this is the symbol for the capacitor. And we use that to store the energy as electrical energy. All right, so I'm going to bring this up so you can see it. So we have our load, our power supply, and this is our capacitor. So our capacitor is now storing the energy. So the energy comes in and it stores some of it and it feeds some of it. And as the load demands more than we are supplying, the capacitor can give up some of its energy to help balance that. So that's an energy storage style capacitor. So that's what I mean when I say it acts as an accumulator or a pressure tank or even a balloon. It's able to store energy and then give that energy when it's needed. Now granted, that's a super basic way to look at it, and there's a lot of other things you can do with that. For example, say I want to build a timer circuit, or say I want to turn a light or a sound on and off repeatedly. I can put a resistor in there and I can regulate how fast the capacitor charges and how fast the capacitor discharges. If you use one resistor for both charge and discharge, then you'll have an equal on and off time. And if I use a different resistor for charge than discharge, then you'll have a different amount of time between its on and off cycle. So there's lots of different things you can do with that. Straight up blinking lights, all these Christmas lights that do the blinking and stuff, and circuits in computers that are simply timed to repeat a thing often, just consistently sit there and repeat it, can use a capacitor paired with a resistor to charge and discharge in its given period of time. This isn't used quite as often nowadays. A lot of electronic devices are going to semiconductors and digital interfaces where we can actually program it to do different things. But at the heart of how things work, it still exists. So that's one way a capacitor is used. Now these capacitors are oftentimes used in a different way. So these capacitors are often used as a phase generator. Bear with me, I know it's not the right term, but I think it'll work in this case. Induction motors, they work by taking a current, generating a magnetic field, and then changing that magnetic field to push a rotor around. Now, in order to do that, we need to push the rotor in a certain direction. And the way we can push the rotor in that direction is to have a series of coils, one after the other, energize. So one energizes, and the second one energizes, then a third one energizes. And in doing so, we can get that rotor to follow that current, or follow the charged coils. In a single phase motor, we only have one phase and a neutral to create these coils with, which means we can only, at best, energize 1 and 2. If we energize 1 and 2, and then energize 1 again, the rotor can actually turn backwards because it can get confused as to which 2 it needs to go to. Yeah, which 2 it needs to go to. Point being, there's no third to carry it the final direction. These capacitors are actually used to create a third leg that's very weak, but gets the job done to create that third coil that keeps the rotor moving in the direction you want it to move. Even if it provides a gap so that one coil is stronger or closer than another energized, either way, it gets the rotor going in the right direction. once the rotor is going in the right direction, then it's also a little easier to keep it moving in that right direction because, again, it is another coil that's actually doing something. So in order for that to happen, we take L1 neutral, right? So we have our two legs, and then we come down here with our capacitor to a third leg. Now what's happening at this point is the capacitor is taking the voltage from one side, and because of how a capacitor works, it's actually generating a voltage on the other side. In order to understand why it does that, we have to talk about the science of how these things work. Here's the diagram for this. So we have our line 1 and our neutral, that's single phase. In order to have that third winding, we simply take a capacitor off of line 1 and then we feed the other end of the capacitor over here. Now let's talk about the science of why this works. Inside of the capacitor, what is happening is what is called an electrical force. We are actually creating, by applying voltage to one side of what's possibly, I say possibly, I believe it's aluminum, a field of aluminum, we are actually creating an electrical force much like lightning. I say much like, it's not exactly like, but much like lightning. You have the sky is one field or one plate, and the ground is the other plate. And what happens is you build up an electrical force between these two plates, and you end up with an inverse charge in the other plate. So when we charge this plate positively, we get a negative charge on this plate. When we charge this plate negatively, we get a positive charge on this plate because of the electrical force. And if you think, well, that sounds a lot like magic. No, it's not the Jedi kind of force. Unfortunately, that'd be cool, but it's not. Give it though, that's the science of how these things work. On one side of the capacitor, I apply voltage. I apply whatever it is. In this case, these capacitors can handle 440 volts AC, but that means 440 volts total. If you're using AC, then you're going to be 220 volts positive and 220 volts negative. That means we can use this capacitor on a 220 volt circuit. Now, you're going to ask, why in the world does that make any kind of sense? Why are we doubling our voltage? We'll get to that in another video. But in this video, we can say when we apply the voltage to one side of the capacitor, we are going to induce a voltage on the other side of the capacitor through the electrical force. It's not exactly static. It's not exactly magnetic. It's an electrical force. It's a very small one though. And in fact, the rating on this is 30 microfarads. And the microfarads, the whole way capacitors work was discovered by Michael Faraday in a laboratory a long time ago. So they decided to name the rating of these things farads. So the farad indicates how many amps that the second leg can handle at one time. And it's a little more complicated than that, but it really has to do with how much it can discharge quickly, because that's the difference between a capacitor and a battery. A battery uses chemical energy to produce electricity, whereas a capacitor stores energy through electrical force and can release that energy very quickly. That's oftentimes what kills people with these things. So that's it for my really unscientific layman's explanation of how capacitors work. So there's a whole lot of information in there that we could have gone over, and feel free to Google it and look it up. It's very interesting how these things work. It's very interesting how they affect our lives in general. So go ahead, check them out. Watch other videos from people like Smarter Every Day, who is an engineer and can explain exactly the science and formulas of how these things work. For now, I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was fun making it, and I will see you in the next video. Till then, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button if you actually enjoyed this, and you guys have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Good job. Good job. Good job.